They cut down my tree without asking, a tree that had been standing on my land longer than anyone in that gated neighborhood had even been alive, and by the time I realized what they'd done, all that was left was a stump and the smell of fresh sawdust hanging in the air like something had died. I didn't yell, didn't call anyone, didn't even move for a while, because the truth is, when something like that hits you, real deep, it doesn't come out as anger right away, it comes out as silence. I remember stepping out of my truck that afternoon, boots hitting the gravel just like they had every day for the past 15 years, and something already fell off before I even saw it. Maybe it was the way the light hit the porch too directly, or how the breeze felt different across the yard, and then I looked up, and where there used to be this massive oak stretching its arms across half the sky, there was just empty space. That tree wasn't just some tree you forget about. My great-granddad planted it back when this whole area was farmland. Before anyone thought about gated entries and HOA fees, my dad used to tell me stories about how he'd tie a rope swing to one of its branches, how the whole family would gather under it in the summers, drinking iced tea and arguing about nothing. And when I was a kid, I learned how to climb on that tree before I even knew how to ride a bike. It was the kind of thing you don't think twice about until it's gone. And just like that, it was gone. I walked closer, slow at first, like maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, like if I blinked hard enough, it might come back. But no, all I saw was a clean-cut stump, wide and pale, rings exposed like some kind of open wound, sawdust scattered across the dirt, still fresh, still bright. They hadn't even tried to hide it. That's when I noticed the notice, zip tied to my fence post, flapping a little in the breeze like it had every right to be there, laminated, of course. HOA always loved their laminated notices. I pulled it off, read it once, then again slower. Hazard removal for community safety, authorized by board directive. Community safety. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes when something's that ridiculous, your brain just doesn't know what else to do. I turned in a slow circle, looking around my land. 10 acres of open space, chickens wandering near the coop, my old red barn leaning just a little to the left like it always had, and then beyond that, the clean, perfect lines of the HOA neighborhood, identical houses, identical lawns, identical lives. And somewhere in their little meetings, sitting around polished tables, they decided my tree, was a problem. The thing is, that oak wasn't even on their property. Not even close, but it was tall, and it was visible from their side, rising above their rooftops like something that didn't belong in their carefully curated world. It didn't match their symmetry, didn't follow their rules, didn't ask for permission, and I guess that bothered them more than they were willing to admit. I knelt down by the stump and ran my hand across the surface. It was smooth, almost too smooth, professional cut, not some random act, not a storm, not decay. This was planned. They sent people onto my land, fired up chainsaws, and took it down while I was gone. No call, no knock, no warning, just gone. I don't know how long I stayed there like that, crouched in the dirt, hand on that stump like I was trying to feel something still alive underneath. But eventually I stood up, brushed the dust off my jeans, and that's when I started noticing the rest of it. Tracks. Deep ones, cutting through the soil from the back end of my property, not the front. Whoever came in, they didn't even bother using the main road. They drove straight through the field, left ruts like scars across the land, and those tracks led somewhere. I followed them, step by step, slow and quiet, like I was piecing together a story I hadn't agreed to be part of. The tracks curved around the barn, cut past the garden, and ended right near my utility shed, small, weathered, nothing special from the outside. Most people wouldn't even give it a second look. But I did. Because that shed, that little, overlooked, ignored structure, it wasn't just mine. I stood there for a second, staring at the door, something starting to shift in my chest. Not quite anger yet, not exactly satisfaction either. More like clarity, the kind that creeps in when all the pieces finally start lining up. I reached for the handle, paused, and just stood there, thinking. About the tree, about my great-granddad, about the notice flapping on the fence like it meant something, about the fact that people who didn't own an inch of my land somehow felt entitled to change it. And then I opened the door. Inside, it was just how I remembered, dust in the corners, tools hanging where I left them, and right there along the back wall, the main electrical junction box. Not just for my place, for there's two. That setup went back decades, long before those houses were built, long before their HOA even existed. The power lines ran through this land because this land used to be the center of everything. And when the developers came in years ago, they didn't want to reroute it, too expensive, too complicated. So they made a deal with my grandfather. A handshake. That was it. No contracts. No easements. No paperwork tying my land to theirs. Just trust. I let out a slow breath, stepped closer to the panel, and rested my hand on the metal casing. It hummed faintly, steady, reliable, feeding power to an entire neighborhood that had just decided my property was theirs to manage. And right then, right there, something inside me settled. Not exploded. Settled. Like the answer had been waiting the whole time. I didn't rush it, didn't act out of pure anger, because this wasn't about losing control, this was about taking it back. I flipped the latch, opened the panel, and looked at the master switch. Big. Simple. Final. I remember thinking, if I do this, there's no walking it back easily. This isn't some petty complaint or phone call. This changes things. But then again, so did cutting down that tree. I wrapped my fingers around the switch, held it there for just a second, and in that moment, all I could see was that empty patch of sky where something used to stand. Then I pulled it down. Everything went quiet. Not just around me, but in a way you can feel more than hear. Like the air itself shifted, like something bigger had just stopped. And I stood there, in that little shed, listening to the silence, knowing exactly what I'd just done, and for the first time since I got home that day, I didn't feel helpless anymore. I felt even. I didn't rush out to see the reaction, didn't grab my phone, didn't walk up to the fence like some kind of spectator. I just stood there for a minute longer, letting that silence settle into my bones, because it had been a long time since anything in my life felt that balanced. Then I closed the panel, stepped out of the shed, and went about my evening like nothing had happened, fed the chickens, checked the garden, poured myself a cup of coffee even though it was already getting late, and all the while, in the distance, I could see it starting. At first it was subtle, porch lights flickering out one by one, like someone was slowly dimming their whole world, then garage doors freezing halfway open, golf carts stalling in driveways, and after that people. You could always tell when something disrupted that neighborhood, because they weren't used to things going wrong. Not really. Everything over there was controlled, scheduled, predictable, so when it wasn't, they didn't know how to act. I watched from my porch as a few of them gathered near the clubhouse, standing in little clusters, phones in hand, looking around like the answer might just appear if they stared hard enough. I didn't go over. I didn't need to. By the next morning, the knock came. Sharp, confident, the kind of knock that assumes it's going to be answered quickly. I opened the door, already knowing who it would be, and there she was, not Marjorie this time. Not yet. This was Daniel Cross, vice president of the HOA, mid-40s, expensive watch, the kind of guy who smiles without ever really meaning it. Morning, he said, like we were neighbors in the normal sense of the word, like we hadn't just crossed a line you don't come back from. We've got a bit of a situation. I leaned against the doorframe, coffee in hand. Seems like it. He glanced past me, like he expected to see something inside that would explain it all. The neighborhood's without power. I noticed it's quieter, I said. That smile of his tightened just a little. We've been told the main junction runs through your property. Runs through it. Sits on it. Depends how you look at it. He nodded slowly, like he was still trying to keep things polite. Right. So we're going to need you to switch that back on. I took a sip of coffee, let the pause stretch just enough to make it uncomfortable. Are you now? That's when the tone shifted, just a little, but enough. Look, I don't know what you think this is, but you can't just cut power to an entire community. And there it was, that assumption again, that quiet belief that their rules somehow extended beyond their fences. I stepped aside, reached over to the table just inside the door, and picked up my phone, pulled up the photo I'd taken the day before, the stump, bright and raw, sawdust still scattered around it, and held it out to him. This was on my land, I said. He glanced at it, barely a second. We've already addressed that internally. Internally, I repeated, almost smiling. That's interesting, considering it wasn't your property. He exhaled through his nose, patience starting to wear thin. The tree was a hazard. It was diseased. No, it wasn't. We had it evaluated. By who? He didn't answer that one. Just shifted his weight, looked past me again like maybe someone else would step in and take over the conversation. They trespassed, I said, voice steady, not raised, just certain. They came onto my land and cut something down that didn't belong to them. We acted in the community's best interest. I nodded slowly. Funny thing about that, so am I. That's when the smile disappeared completely. You're making a mistake, he said, quieter now, more direct. This is going to escalate. I took another sip of coffee, set the mug down on the railing. It already did. He stood there for a second longer, like he was deciding whether to push harder or pull back. And in the end, he chose control, or what he thought was control. We'll be in touch, he said, turning to leave. I'm sure you will, I replied. By midday, the generators showed up. Big ones, loud, the kind that don't just sit quietly in the background but demand to be noticed. They parked them near the clubhouse, ran cables across sidewalks, through yards, over driveways, and just like that, their perfect little neighborhood started to look messy. And the noise, constant, low, vibrating through everything. You couldn't escape it. Not inside, not outside. It was the kind of sound that gets into your head after a while, makes everything feel just a little off. I heard later from one of the delivery guys who stops by my place sometimes that people were already complaining, headaches, trouble sleeping, food going bad faster than they could manage, and the gates, those big decorative security gates they were so proud of, stuck open. No control. By the second day, things started slipping further, tempers rising, people arguing in driveways, kids complaining about the heat, security systems down, and somewhere in the middle of all that, the story started spreading. Not from them. From me. I'd made a few calls the night before, filed a police report for trespassing and destruction of property, documented everything, photos, timestamps, the notice they left behind, and then, almost as an afterthought, I sent it all over to a local reporter I knew, someone who'd covered a zoning dispute out here years ago. Didn't expect much. But by day 3 it hit. Private landowner cuts power after HOA removes historic tree. They used that word, historic. I won't lie. I appreciated that. The article laid it out clean. No dramatics, just facts. The tree, the lack of permission, the handshake agreement about the power line, and just enough detail to make people ask the right questions. And they did. Because by that afternoon, the energy in that neighborhood had changed, and not in the way the board wanted. People weren't mad at me. They were mad at them. I could see it in the way residents gathered in bigger groups now, voices louder, more animated, pointing toward the clubhouse, toward the generators, toward anything that represented the people who made that decision. I even had a couple of them walk down toward my fence, didn't cross it, I'll give them that, but close enough to call out. One older guy, maybe late 60s, baseball cap, sunburned neck, looked over and said, "You really got the whole place shut down?" I shrugged. Seems that way. He let out a low whistle. Hell of a move. Another woman, standing next to him, arms crossed, shook her head. They told us that tree was rotting. It wasn't, I said. She nodded slowly, like she already knew that. And that's when I realized something. This wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't even just about the tree. It was about control, about who gets to decide what matters and what doesn't. And for the first time since that neighborhood was built, that control wasn't sitting with the board. By the end of day 3, I got another knock. This time it was her, Marjorie Ellis. And she didn't look nearly as composed as I imagined she would. Marjorie Ellis stood on my porch like she'd been rehearsing the moment the whole walk over. Blazer still perfectly pressed, clipboard still tucked under her arm. But the expression, that was new, tight around the edges, like something was cracking underneath all that control she was used to carrying. I didn't say anything at first, just opened the door and let the silence sit there between us, because sometimes silence does more work than words ever could. "Mr. Carter," she said finally, voice measured, but not as sharp as I expected. "We need to resolve this." I leaned against the doorframe again, same spot as the day before, same cup of coffee in my hand. Routine has a way of grounding you when everything else is shifting. Seems like you needed to resolve something before cutting down a tree on land you don't own. Her jaw tightened just slightly. That decision was made based on expert evaluation and... "Stop," I said, not loud, just enough to cut through the script she was about to run. "Don't come up here and pretend this was about safety." That hit. I could see it in the way her posture shifted, just a fraction, like she wasn't used to being interrupted or questioned, especially not by someone outside her system. The tree was a liability. she tried again. But there was less conviction now, more effort. No, I said, shaking my head slowly. The tree didn't match your view. That one landed harder. For a second, she didn't respond, just looked past me, out across the property, like she was seeing it differently for the first time. The uneven ground, the barn, the chickens wandering without any kind of pattern, and the empty space where something used to stand. We're prepared to make this right, she said finally, shifting gears. We'll replace the tree, mature growth, professionally planted, will cover all costs, and we can discuss a formal maintenance agreement for the power infrastructure moving forward. It sounded good, clean, reasonable, the kind of offer that would probably settle things in most situations. But most situations don't start with someone walking onto your land and cutting down 100 years of history like it's an inconvenience. I took a breath, let it out slow, and looked right at her. Too late. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Excuse me. You didn't ask before, I said. You don't get to negotiate after. Now the edge came back, not full force, but enough to show. You're holding an entire community hostage over a tree. I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because of how predictable it was. No, I said, I'm holding you accountable for a decision you thought you wouldn't have to answer for. There it was again, that moment where control slips just enough to make people uncomfortable, and she felt it. You're going to create long-term consequences here, she said, voice lower now, more direct. Legal ones. I already filed, I replied. Trespassing. Property damage. You'll be hearing from my attorney. That landed exactly how I expected. Not shock, not outrage, just calculation. You could almost see the numbers running behind her eyes, the risk, the exposure, the cost of a fight they didn't plan for. What do you want? She asked finally. Simple question. Complicated answer. I stepped out onto the porch, closed the distance just enough so we were standing on equal ground. No barrier, no doorway. Just two people looking at the same problem from very different sides. You're going to reroute your power line, I said. Her expression didn't change right away, but I could tell she understood what that meant. That would require a full infrastructure project. Yeah, I said. It would. That's months of work. Permits, contractors, excavation. And none of it touches my land, I added. Silence again. Wind moving through the open space where the tree used to be. No leaves to catch it anymore. Just air passing through like something missing. That's not a reasonable demand, she said. I shrugged lightly. Was cutting down my tree reasonable? She didn't answer, because there wasn't one. We stood there a few seconds longer, and then she gave a small nod. Not agreement, not yet, but acknowledgement, like she realized the position she was in wasn't one she could talk her way out of. We'll need to review this with the board, she said. Take your time, I replied. Generators seem to be working out great. That one got to her. Not visibly, not in a way most people would catch, but I saw it. Just a flicker, frustration breaking through the control. She turned without another word and walked back down the path. Heels steady, posture still composed, but slower than when she arrived. And just like that, the conversation was over. The project started 2 weeks later. You could hear it before you saw it. Heavy equipment rolling in, digging trenches along the outer edge of their property, crews working long days under the sun, running new lines, setting new poles, building an entirely separate system that had nothing to do with me anymore. Exactly how it should have been from the start. 6 months. 6 months of generators humming day and night. 6 months of complaints, adjustments, workarounds. 6 months of that neighborhood learning what it feels like when convenience disappears and control isn't guaranteed. I didn't interfere, didn't comment, didn't involve myself in their process at all. I just lived my life the way I always had: fixed fences, tended the garden, went into town when I needed to, and every now and then, I'd sit out near the edge of my property and watch. Not out of spite, just awareness. Because once you see how quickly things can change when someone decides your space is theirs to manage, you don't forget it. The lawsuit settled quietly. No admission of wrongdoing. Of course, there never is. But the compensation covered more than just the tree, and I made sure part of it went into something that mattered. I kept the stump, didn't grind it down, didn't remove it. Had a local craftsman come out, a guy named Eli who's been working with longer than I've been alive, and together, we turned what was left into something new. A bench. Wide, solid, carved right out of the heart of that oak. sanded smooth, but still carrying the shape of what it used to be. Rings visible, lines telling a story most people wouldn't even know how to read. We placed it right along the property line, facing their neighborhood, not as a threat, not as a statement, just where it belonged. Sometimes in the evenings, I sit there with a cup of coffee, watching the sun drop behind those identical rooftops, golf carts rolling by a little slower now, people glancing over every once in a while, some curious, some respectful, some probably still annoyed. And I don't wave, but I don't look away either. Because the thing about all this, it wasn't really about revenge, not in the way people like to think. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about a line, one that had always been there, even if nobody paid attention to it until it got crossed. They crossed it, and all I did was remind them it existed. Now here's the part one still think about sometimes, maybe more than I expected, because depending on who you ask, this whole thing looks very different. Some people say I overreacted, that it was just a tree, that cutting power to hundreds of homes crossed a line of its own. Others say I did exactly what needed to be done, that if I hadn't pushed back that hard, they would have kept pushing further. Truth is, I don't know if there's a clean answer. I know what it meant to me. I know what they did. And I know what it took to make sure it didn't happen again. So I'll leave it to you. Was it justified, or did I take it too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I read more of them than you'd think. And if you've ever dealt with something like this, neighbors, HOAs, people deciding what's yours without asking, I want to hear that too. And if you want more stories like this, the kind that sits somewhere between right and wrong depending on where you stand, go ahead and subscribe. Because trust me, this wasn't the only time things got complicated out here.